Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Transcelerate public webinar on the Digital Data Flow Initiative. We're excited to talk today about ways that DDF is seeking to modernize clinical trials and have a chat with several of our esteemed panelists today to share updates on progress and cross-industry collaboration. Let's get started with the agenda. Today's agenda will include a few opening remarks on your participation in today's webinar, as well as introductions of our panelists. We'll then share updates on the DDF initiative following the successful launch of our first minimum viable product. And then we'll spend the balance of the webinar on discussion with our panelists and Q&A. Just a few ground rules before we dive in. We do want to make sure this discussion is helpful and answer as many of your questions as we can. Please note that participation is voluntary, as is using Transcelerate assets and tools. The responsibility for compliance with laws and regulations is owned by solution adopters, and you do not have to identify what company you work for. Things we would ask you not to discuss: the vendors, sites, CROs, customers, or clients you are doing business with, and what tech products or services you are or are not using. Any issues you may be having with vendors, sites, CROs, tech products or services, long-term development plans, or anything related to costs or prices. We cannot answer questions today about vendors or the costs of using or implementing Transcelerate assets, or which member companies are using specific vendors, products, or assets. Please note that all lines have been muted to ensure a pleasant listening experience for all attendees. You'll notice in this GoToWebinar platform that you can reduce the control panel for a better view of the presentation. This can be done by clicking the orange and white arrow in the upper right corner. We also welcome questions throughout the discussion today. Those can be submitted using the questions function in your control panel. Be sure to select send after typing your question in the box. Questions that do not get answered today will be answered and included in the DDF frequently asked questions that are available on Transcelerate's website following the webinar. And as a reminder, this webinar may be recorded in whole or in part. Finally, before I pass to our moderator today, let's start with a quick audience poll. We'd love to hear from you all about your current understanding of the Digital Data Flow Initiative. You should soon see a poll launch on your screen, and we'll give everyone a few seconds to respond to this poll. Great, see a lot of responses coming in. All right, let's take a look at the responses. So it looks like we have a fair amount of the audience, a little over half, who can explain DDF somewhat, which is great. A few others who can explain at a high level or in more detail, and about 20% who have no idea. So wonderful that you've joined today. I think we'll be able to answer a lot of the questions that you might have about the DDF initiative through the presentation and also the panel discussion today. So thank you everyone for joining. All right, without further ado, I have the pleasure of introducing our moderator for today's webinar, Allison Luckman. Allison is the Development Operations Innovation Director at Amgen and has played a key leadership role in the DDF initiative over the past year. Allison, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kelsey. I hope you can hear me clearly. Thank you for the opportunity to moderate the panel today. Today we're joined by an expert panel from across the pharma industry, as well as the tech vendor community, who will be part of our discussion on DDF, looking at the vision of digital data flow and value to our ecosystem of stakeholders across the clinical study value chain. I'm going to start by introducing my Transcelerate colleagues. First of all, Bill Ilitz, Global Head of Collaboration and Technology Strategy, Clinical Development and Analytics from Novartis, who leads the DDF workstream for Transcelerate. And my colleague from Amgen, Bob Hayden, Architecture Director for R&D Informatics at Amgen, and one of my co-leadership team colleagues for the Transcelerate Digital Data Flow initiative. I'd also like to welcome representatives from some of our collaborating vendors from downstream systems. Julie Smiley joins us from Oracle. She's Senior Director of Life Sciences and Product Strategy. Matt Petrella is VP for Strategic Alliances from Red Cap Cloud. Galen Ritter is the Head of Analytics, Innovation and Digital Health at BMS. And Justin Shepherd is from IBM Watson Health. He's the IBM Clinical Development Services Team Manager. So thank you to all of the panel for joining us today. So with that, let's start off by discussing the launch of the MVP solution. If we can move to the next slide, please. And the next slide. So back one slide, apologies. So just to quickly introduce you all to Transcelerate. So Transcelerate is a non-profit organization comprised of 20 top global biopharmaceutical companies that collaborate on key challenges in the industry. We're dedicated to help improve and advance the research and development of new therapies and medicines. Next slide, please. So I'm going to move more specifically to digital data flow across the study lifecycle. And the primary aim of digital data flow is to really break the document paradigm, catalyzing the digital transformation across the study lifecycle. Digital data flow provides end-to-end traceability for study definitions data from the point of creation through the study lifecycle to regulatory submission. The MVP, as shown on this slide, for DDF, creates the foundation for digital flow of study definitions data and demonstrates interoperability between a study builder, the study definitions repository, which I'll talk about a little bit in a further slide, and an EDC system. Essentially, write once, read once. Further enhancement releases are going to add connections to additional systems which also consume this study protocol data, such as clinical trial management systems and data collection systems. It will also enable automated document setup and submission. So write once, read many times. Beyond this, future work will look across the study lifecycle, enabling ease of collaboration across research partners based on structured data and workflow, rather than on static documents that require interpretation. Automation of systems configuration, site workflow, e-source setup, digital risk-based monitoring, etc. Analytics for improved study design and automated design support and amendment impact assessments, reducing patient and site burden. And then finally, looking to also introduce flexibility to scale and build a dynamic trials execution approach without either adopting an integrated platform or limiting product or technology options. Next slide, please. So let's dig a little deeper on the recent MVP launch, which was released earlier this year in April. So within the DDF project, we've delivered a reference implementation of a novel central component that sits between upstream and downstream systems. The reference implementation is a viable, functioning environment that showcases associated clinical data standards, technical capabilities, and connectivity with the clinical systems infrastructure. And this particular reference implementation consists of a study definitions repository. It's deployed using data and API standards that have been developed by CDISC. It demonstrates connectivity to various upstream and downstream systems, but was built with vendor agnostic principles in mind. When implemented, this DDF conceptual design, including the data standards and the standard APIs, can provide a robust and common foundation for all digital protocol producing systems to send structured study definitions data to all systems that need to consume that data to execute a clinical trial. This foundation is the basis for consistent end-to-end data flow. It'll provide the interoperability that's needed to stimulate adoption standards and spur further innovation in automation and innovation by the clinical systems marketplace. The MVP is focused on enabling the flow of study definitions data from study builders through the study definition repository and onwards into EDC systems. Next slide, please. So where are we today? The SDR reference implementation enables pharma companies to build and/or test integrations to systems which use standardized protocol study definition data model. It enables technology solution providers to apply DDF interoperability solution to current offerings as well as to future product roadmaps. The SDR's basis is a unified study definitions model, which has been developed by CDISC, and that standardizes the data model for protocol study definitions. So the MVP release is built to consume CDISC's standard protocol study definitions data model from an upstream source, so a study builder, a content authoring tool, or a conformant file source data. And the DDF MVP release will focus on enabling flow of study definitions data from that study builder through the SDR to EDC, as I mentioned on a previous slide. It'll enable us to store, view, and search study concepts and different versions of the same study. And it will enable automated setup of EDC and clinical databases using the study definitions that have been pulled from the study definitions repository. The SDR-RI, or the reference implementation, has the following functionality built in for MVP. Consume and store digital study protocol data based on that unified study definitions model created by CDISC from an upstream source. Allow the search view capabilities of a study protocol in the SDR, as well as allowing comparison of different versions of the same study. It'll enable systems to pull study definitions from the SDR, and it'll also enable organizations to stand up their own private instance of the SDR. Next slide, please. So we have a number of DDF assets that are available now. They're available for you to utilize immediately to explore DDF in practice. So we've got the reference implementation that I've spoken to a little bit already. That's a running instance of the study definitions repository in a pre-production environment. And that might be used by companies to test data flow, connectivity, and to run pilots. Access to that environment and that running instance is available upon request. Infrastructure as code enables organizations to deploy a private instance of the SDR in their own cloud environment, if that's what the organization would like to do. Source code and documentation has been made available through GitHub, and that's a public repository for open source software code. GitHub also provides the opportunity for community engagement and feedback. It includes the source code for the reference implementation, and it also includes a variety of supporting documentation, such as the solution architecture, process flows, a pilot considerations guide has also been created for member companies wishing to pilot. The CDISC standards are also utilized, so the unified study definitions model is provided with controlled terminology, sample data conformant with the USDM, and API specifications. And next slide, please. Okay, so where are we on the DDF journey? everything that we've previously discussed leads logically to where are we today in this journey. Whilst the MVP was released back in April, the growth does not stop there. Future events include a public connectathon, which we're planning to hold in Q3. For the study builder and the EDC vendor design collaboration, the initial discussions and alignment between technical solution teams, so the RA and the RI for USDM and SDR, and study builders, EDC vendors to collaborate on the study definitions repository design compatibility to receive and send data. For the protocol, digitizing a portion of the study data elements included in the common protocol template significantly facilitates for automated protocol document enablement. And the MVP also includes limited EDC integration, digitizing a portion of the study data elements, enabling partial automated EDC build. And moving to the next slide, we'll look a little bit at DDF on GitHub, access and information. So as I've already mentioned, we're utilizing GitHub as the repository for our open source software code for the SDR MVP and any associated documentation. And you can see listed here a number of different assets which are available within GitHub for you to view. And the next slide, please. There are a variety of different ways in which you're able to engage with DDF, and that includes the DDF webpage on the Transcelerate website. We also have the GitHub DDF repositories, which I've referenced already. We've got public webinars such as today, and previous public webinar recordings can also be accessed. We have transformation tools available. We have videos of DDF. There are FAQs, posters, DDF overviews available. And if you would actually like to engage more closely with us, there's also a DDF information form and mailbox. The email address is there on the screen for you to engage directly with us. And as I mentioned on a previous slide, we also have the DDF Connectathon taking place in Q3 of this year. So with that, I think it's time to move to our panel discussion. And we will start that discussion by turning to Bob initially to talk a little bit about how we can get started on DDF MVP. So Bob, now that we've launched the MVP, what's the best way for us to be able to access the code and the content for the study definitions repository reference implementation?
Yep, sure, Allison. So you mentioned the GitHub site and repository, so that's the place to start. That's where you'd find the SDR MVP release. As you noted, it's an implementation of the CDISC reference architecture. So that includes the data model that we call the Unified Study Definitions Model, the API specifications for exchanging that USDM formatted data with other systems. And so, you know, many of the assets you described, I'll talk about the important ones, the reference implementation itself. So that, again, that's like it's a running instance that's hosted in the cloud environment, and that can be used as a pre-production environment. The infrastructure is code scripts, which are there to automate the deployment. So if deploying into another cloud environment or doing a private deployment, those scripts can be used to automate that provisioning. There's a solution architecture, a document there to outline the design decisions. It describes the platform and the frameworks used, database configuration, the data model, and then things like security and identity considerations. There's process flows and essential user stories, and then other supporting documentation like the business and for business and IT resources. That's also available on that landing page as a starting point. I'll just summarize too that the functionality that you'll find in that MVP release. So as Allison mentioned, or as you mentioned, Allison, the APIs are in there to receive the digital study protocol from an upstream source like a study builder. There's APIs for consuming that in downstream EDC systems. Those conformance checks that were mentioned too, those are part of the API operations to ensure consistency and that data meets the requirements of the USDM. There's also functionality to view the protocols that are stored in the SDR and do some basic version comparisons across the same study. And then there's audit trail, some basic audit trail functionality that's also in there to track specific study elements. So, in summary, the way to obtain the assets, including that reference implementation code base, is as you mentioned, to go to the DDF repos. Those are on the Transcelerate's GitHub site.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Bob, for taking us through that. So I'm going to turn to Bill at this point. Bill, do you have any guidance on how to start adopting DDF within your own companies?
Sure, Alison. I think the short answer I would give is no surprises. It depends. And it depends, I would say, on primarily two factors. What you already know about DDF, to what extent you've been following the DDF journey over the past 2 years, or at least through our last webinar in February. And it also depends on the type of organization you work for and the business strategy and technical roadmaps that you have in your existing organization and how those apply to the scope of DDF around digitized protocols. So if you don't have a grounding in the overall vision, if you're in that no idea category from the poll earlier, then I would definitely recommend you get started with the Transcelerate DDF Home repository on GitHub and look for the Getting Started file. It was already mentioned in some of the slides earlier, and there you'll find the DDF overview video, links to other introductory information on the study definitions repository itself, and the USDM data model that's been developed. After that, you might proceed to explore some of the other folders in the DDF Home directory. Look around, open files, start to get familiar with the totality of what's there. And in particular, I'd recommend to look into the Documents folder, where you'll find a one-page change management journey, which takes you through a series of suggestions, moving through stages from awareness to understanding, exploration, experience, through to adoption. And for each of those stages, it gives some recommended resources to look at. So that's a great place to get started. Then for those of you that were in some of the other categories in the poll from this morning in the middle or to the right side, you might want to jump in at other places in the GitHub repository, such as the architecture folder that Bob mentioned for more specifics about the SDR solution, how you can deploy it. Start familiarizing yourself with the scope and content of the Unified Study Definitions model. That model has some complexity to it, and you're going to need to spend some time with it to understand the different components of the model and how it all fits together. I think in getting started, the other thing I would recommend, it would be worthwhile to assess how DDF, digital protocols, and the automated data flows that are part of our vision, how those relate to your existing strategies, your own visions, your technology roadmaps within your respective organizations. This will help you, I think, define the first phase of activities on an adoption pathway that you may take. You might want to assess, for example, study builder or e-protocol authoring tools that you already have deployed or are planning to deploy, or internal study level metadata repositories, for instance, against the USDM data model to understand how compliant you might be or how much connection or overlap there is between what you might have done to date in this space of clinical study protocols and data models and what now we're coming forward with as an industry standard to enable structured and standardized data flows. Ultimately, based on that, you might want to start thinking about and planning to implement your own specific pilots or proof of concepts. And that's a great way to kind of dig in and get started at the next level of detail, looking at things like integrations between new or existing protocol authoring tools and the SDR reference implementation, or from the SDR reference implementation to downstream systems that consume protocol information to try to prove out What can we receive from this study definitions repository? What are those standards? How do they come into my downstream systems? And how can they then be used to automate processes in the downstream systems? This, of course, would help you gain experience with the solutions and prove out some of the flows that we're seeking and trying to make effective. I think finally I would mention that the adoption and considerations and getting started depends on what type of organization you represent, where you're coming from. Now, if you're coming from a pharma company that sponsors clinical studies, you might want to start with the as-is data flows that you have in your organization around protocol authoring and study startup, and look into that in more detail, and then start to understand how DDF and the solutions that we have would impact that. If you're from a CRO, you might be interested in how being able to exchange digital executable protocol data might change the way you offer services to others in the pharma industry, and how the DDF solution might fit into that picture. If you're from a health authority, you might be thinking about how a standardized digital protocol could change protocol submission and manual review processes for protocols, and potential integrations with internal systems that build towards end-to-end traceability. And if you're from a software solution provider, some of whom we have on the panel today and we'll hear from in a little bit, you may want to consider how building DDF compatibility into your product fits into your overall product roadmaps, and begin to explore the technical integration patterns incorporating the USDM and the API-based data exchanges. And Bob, I maybe want to ask you, we've been collaborating with a number of the vendors, some of whom are on the call today. If you could give a little bit more detail on the nature of that collaborations and how that's been running to date.
Yep, sure, Bill. Yeah, so we have, I would say, multiple engagement channels. We have a monthly vendor collaboration meeting to discuss topics like the roadmap, the functional roadmap, reference architecture changes such as USDM enhancements. We would get feedback on things like the ability to support the APIs from the vendors. So that's one meeting that we have. Another one is a more technical topic focused meeting that we do on a weekly basis to talk through more specific topics like if a technical design, a new technical design is being introduced, if we're talking, for example, the security model that would be used for the APIs, any major architectural changes like the components that are being used in different parts of the stack. And then also for those architecture changes, we have like kind of a mini architecture review board where we review the changes and the impact that those are going to have on the product and vendors. So those are some meetings that are set up at that recurrent cadence. We also have specific points of contact, so individuals from the team that are subject matter experts that are available to vendors to get started and answer questions. So while there is a lot of materials that are available, as described earlier, there's always going to be questions that come up or implementation challenges in some cases, and those SMEs, those points of contact, are available to quickly answer questions and talk through different options.
Great, thanks, Bob. So I hope that gives everybody listening today some idea about how to begin, depending on what type of organization you come from and what you already know or don't know about DDF.
That's great, thanks, Bill. Some great information there around how we can get started with the DDF MVP. So with that, I'd like to turn attention towards the representatives from the vendors that we have collaborating with us on the panel today. So I'm going to start by turning to you, Matt, if that's okay, and just ask, what do you foresee as future possibilities of DDF using a tangible proof of concept?
Yeah, thank you, Allison. So first off, we're relatively new to the Transcelerate team. It's been great to be part of, and great to be part of the collaboration between the sponsors and the solution providers. RedCap Cloud is among other things, a downstream EDC system from the SDR. So when we talk about a tangible POC or what I'll call an MVP, I think the most important thing to focus on is providing value. And value in this space can really be provided in two ways. One, does it cut out time, or does it in my mind, minimize data errors or provide consistency across that data as the data flows to downstream systems and beyond. So for me, I think we need to focus on reusable components, and obviously that's part of the protocol. It's data that's being provided to the EDC and then downstream systems from there potentially. So what are those reusable components and attributes? And what specifically, what can we focus on that would minimize any kind of data error and ensure consistency across the trial? So that would be my focus.
Lovely, thank you, Matt. And interested to hear, Justin, from you with a similar question. From your perspective, what do you see as the future possibilities of DDF?
Sure. So we should be able to demonstrate the flow of DDF study design from the source system into our EDC, IBM Clinical Development. So kind of tracing that flow from sponsor level design to the SDR and then to ICD via an API connection. So we should be able to demonstrate, the additional efficiency and speed you might see during trial design versus the time that it would take to create some of those elements brand new. And depending on sponsor adoption to those particular standards or templates, this could drive further integration and automation solutions over time. So sponsors adhering, to the standard or template design could realize those additional time and effort savings down the line. So of course that comes to a particular challenge that we might face that occurs, of course, during real life database design and may not crop up during a POC, and that is if we are importing designs or forms that don't closely match what is actually needed from the protocol or for the particular design of the study. So it would be important to have a controlled change management process that should hopefully be a combination of technology and a defined process where changes we create would be applied in a very controlled manner to minimize risk or unintended changes, and also to continue to realize those down the line efficiencies that we may have created through standardized data sets and those sorts of things. And so we should use technology, maybe it is our system or something even at the SDR level that should enforce these standards while also facilitating ease of use through the SDR. And so I think that's how we can, really see what a POC might show us through demonstration of that connectivity to ICD. So I'd be interested to see how that goes.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for your insight and for your insight on that and the future opportunities and possibilities from you, Matt, as well. With that, I'd like to turn to Galen and ask, with the work that you've been doing in DDF, what do you feel is important? What is it that excites you about DDF?
Yeah, thanks, Allison. I mean, to me, the most exciting part of this is that we're finally moving away from 150-page PDF documents being blueprints for studies. Coming from an analytics and digital health background, the thousands of hours of my career that I've spent combing through documents like that and pulling out information, there's going to be wonderful to have kind of better uses for some of that time going forward. DDF enabling that kind of digital study blueprint so that you can move through kind of a connected end-to-end digital ecosystem. It's really going to let the people and the systems communicate more effectively across that continuum and really change kind of the dynamic that we've seen in the past of these kind of siloed manual processes because of the lack of communication. So I think for me, the common language of that blueprint really becomes the kind of critically important foundational part of this whole project. And we've needed that for a long time to kind of create this digital pathway. So it's going to be a really important project and a really important enabler for all of the downstream systems. I mean, it also reduces enormous amounts of rework and burden for everybody in the chain, sites, vendors, CROs, sponsors, anybody involved who's doing all of their business based off of those kind of PDFs and everything else. Document flow in the past has really kind of dictated the way we've done all of our processes and all of our system integrations, if we can even call many of them that. So finally seeing kind of the end of that manual combing through documents, I think is going to be a huge enabler and is going to be a huge sea change for the entire industry.
Absolutely, I completely agree. I'm sure there's plenty of us listening in on this webinar that have also experienced the multitude of documentation, the different ways that it gets interpreted, and completely agree with you. And I'm certainly one of them. Thank you for that insight. So Bob, I'm going to turn back to you again, and we're going to switch gears a little bit and start looking at DDF involvement and the way that we can start looking towards benefits. So I'd like to hear from you what type of benefits you see in adopting DDF.
Mm-hmm. Yep, sure. So really the key, the central part of that is the standards, having a standards-based repository really to facilitate that flow of information across the clinical systems that are used for designing and executing a clinical trial. And this is largely a manual process today, right? Manual and it's document-centric, So those benefits would include things like minimizing the process handoffs and data reentry. Not having to take that protocol and re-enter that information. And then that can lead to, that process today can lead to format inconsistencies. So those would be eliminated. That would be a big benefit that would be realized across study startup and execution. And then it's, another benefit is having a foundation for data exchange and interoperability. So this would lead to greater compatibility among systems. And what that would do is give more flexibility to sponsors when selecting technical solutions. Given that they would be open and easier to connect, it wouldn't be such a complex effort to integrate systems, when these standards and APIs exist. And so, that also going back a bit to the minimizing that data reentry, what you see is a more seamless flow of data that can help with accelerating study startup and also providing the foundations for more automation. So, automation is a key to, getting to a reduced time for study startup or for exchanging information or activities that are happening between those systems. And then also by harmonizing the data format and having that interoperability, it's going to lead to more innovation. So, we'll have the opportunity for more vendors to participate, maybe some that are smaller that instead of having to focus on the integration challenges, they can innovate more on product features. So we see that as a great way to spark that innovation in the ecosystem and across the solutions landscape. So so I would summarize that, to say that it's stakeholders adopt DDF, the sponsor companies, the vendor solutions, they'll all benefit by this increased interoperability. And we'll be seeing increased efficiencies and more innovation. And of course, all these changes will lead to getting medicines to patients faster and improving patients' lives. But so, Galen, what benefits do you see? I mean, you mentioned some of them just a minute ago, but are there other benefits that you see in adopting DDF?
Yeah, I think it's one of those rare instances we're going to see kind of improvements in speed, cost, quality, that whole triangle in this at the same time as seeing process simplification. You don't often see innovations that kind of create that kind of positive balance across that. So I think that's going to be really wonderful to see for kind of everyone in the ecosystem. And I also think your point about innovation, couldn't be more true. Enabling this opens up a whole world of possibilities in the innovation side and also on the analytics side. I mean, this is a new data source that all of a sudden comes online for everyone in the industry. That becomes an incredibly powerful, I mean, being on the analytics side, a new data source is a bonanza of opportunity then to look at things that you've never been able to assess before. So I think the innovations, the kind of change of focus that we'll all be able to take is going to be really amazing in this whole process. So it's going to be a really big shift, and it's going to open up all sorts of doors for all of us going forward.
Great.
Thanks for that, Galen. I think you certainly are very animated and certainly excited by the opportunities that DDF bring. I'd like to hear from you, Julie, actually, a similar kind of question. What was it that brought you to DDF? What was it that attracted your interest around digital data flow?
Thanks. Yeah, so, very similar to what Matt and Justin said, we're an EDC vendor as well. And we really think that the artifacts that this initiative is going to produce are very valuable to the industry. There are things, things like the SDR and the USDM. They're things that we can use to really help our customers automate and streamline their data flows, from setup, in the EDC solution, billing standards, even downstream through data cleaning, downstream data sets for submission. So, just, for us personally as a vendor, we want to be out front with innovative solutions. So participating in the project really gives us that early access to understand and learn, and also provide, even our input back, what we think might make it even better or more efficient. Or if there are challenges to really implement it. So really just, how we can do that, and being able to really get in early and do some proofs of concept to prove some of these things out and provide that feedback to make sure it is, something we can use in a systematic way. And then, of course, more generally, we want to provide thought leadership from a technical perspective, but we also want to be working with other thought leaders in the industry to understand the needs overall, and drive towards really thinking about innovative solutions going forward, not just trying to automate the exact same way of doing things. When we went from paper to EDC, a lot of the processes stayed the same, and even though the technology was there, we didn't really rethink it. And this is a great way to really rethink those processes and how we can be the most efficient. So really happy to be involved.
And it's great to have you involved. Thank you. Justin, I'd like to switch over to you at this point, and ask around, how do you see the connectivity and the interface from upstream vendors to vendors such as yourselves?
Sure. So we've already been able to demonstrate using the existing API capability of IBM Clinical Development to connect to MVP SDR and kind of peruse the available designs and pull those down. In the future, we'll be looking for more of a end-to-end, a true end-to-end integration that reduces the setup and maintenance, as well as leveraging some more, advanced tech enablement solutions. So this is basically in line with other systems that we have connected to before to migrate either data or study design data into our system, where we, are going to ask that database designer for some minimum set of details. Maybe it is, what is the SDR location, something like this. But most of that connectivity functionality, API connectivity functionality, would be automated or hard-coded, if you will, in the background, so that it would be relatively easy for that end user to select an SDR and begin pulling designs down. So one thing that doesn't account for that, of course, is our ability to see what is going on outside of our own IBM Clinical Development EDC, right? So if there's some change or issue at that SDR level, potentially that will be a challenge to get connected to that system. So again, kind of as I brought up earlier, it'll be very important for us to have a controlled, change management process to ensure that any changes that we make, are then generated and sent, downstream or upstream to those other systems connecting to that SDR. So that's kind of what I see from a IBM Clinical Development standpoint. Matt, I'm interested also on your take. So how do you see, you connecting or connectivity or interface from upstream vendors to vendors such as yourself?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I'll go back to something Galen said a little while ago, which is the 150-page document. And I think, since I've been in the industry, one of the things that people continuously say is that they're looking for the quote unquote single source of truth across the data. And as that data from that 150-page document gets transposed into multiple systems, it becomes unclear what system is that single point of truth. I think the days of, in my mind, the days of one massive single vendor technology provider that provides all study related systems for a sponsor is kind of outdated. Things now have become modular, and data can be in jeopardy because of that. I mean, data needs to have a single source of truth that's consistent across all of those systems. So when we talk about specific, connectivity, I mean, RedCap Cloud's perspective, we use APIs almost exclusively for all of our integrations. So having the opportunity to use an API to connect into Transcelerate and the SDR really is something that we do on a day-to-day basis. As I mentioned before, we're relatively new, so we're just dipping our toes in now, but it's exciting. It's exciting to collaborate across multiple vendors to ensure that there is that consistency. So when the sponsor does have potentially a modular platform with many vendors involved, there's consistency on how we're accessing that data.
That's great. Thanks, Matt and Justin, for your insights there. And Galen, I think we've heard quite a bit from you around what you see as the benefits kind of in the immediate kind of short term. But be interested to hear from you on what you think are the benefits in applying the DDF solution, even to future product roadmaps.
Yeah, I think it's really going to, I think that coupled with the modularity that Matt mentioned really is going to allow us to create kind of friction user experiences and integrations that leverage that modularity. In the past, those things have kind of had to be left off roadmaps because you really needed kind of monolithic systems to be able to enable some of that. But I think all of us being able to kind of start from that common blueprint is going to change that dynamic significantly and let us do some of those things, those kind of fringe cases that we wanted to do for a long time. I also think that, and I know this is kind of talking my own book a little bit, I also think we're going to see a lot more analytics and a lot more addition of analytics modules to different parts of the process. You can imagine seeing the experiences and the analytics take a different kind of role going forward. You're going to see optimization exercises. You're going to see a lot of those kind of things and a lot of automation in the analytics being driven from this ability to start with that common template language. I think that will be a really big change to some of the roadmaps that we see, which in the past have been very focused on necessary integrations and other components, where now we can kind of take that next step in the journey and look at the kind of more sophisticated analyses and user experience capabilities that are possible.
Thank you. And I think that certainly links us nicely into the next topic, actually, around DDF in the longer term. And with that, I'd like to turn to Bill and just hear from you. What kind of insights do you have about DDF in the long term for the vision and the value of our ecosystem for stakeholders across the clinical study value chain?
Yeah, thanks, Allison. I think, we view what we've done today with the MVP of the solution study definitions repository, the new USDM standard developed with CDISC, as a starting point, right? We're just getting started. We view this as the initial foundation, and we're hoping that this becomes a catalyst to drive the future development and innovation in some of the ways that you heard about from the other panelists in the future. And I would say there's some ways we can't even predict what kind of innovation this is going to lead to. It will be ultimately a resource for many stakeholders in this space to start developing innovative solutions, to find ways to automate based on structured study definitions data, to drive the analytics that Galen was mentioning. And we're very much seeing this as that kind of platform to drive a lot of innovation in the future. Some of the things we want to do is expand the collaborations that we have. You're hearing from some of the vendors today that have signed on early, and that's fantastic. But we're going to be looking to expand that and get more and more stakeholders in the clinical development space involved, because we really believe as an industry, we can only solve this by working together and collaborating. And that's behind our model of releasing this under an open source license and building up an open source community. We'll be running the Connectathon in Q3, as was mentioned, to really start building up momentum in that space. And we're interested in having more and more participants, because this will work on an industry level if we all collaborate on it. If we all go off in our corners and start developing our own solutions and our own protocol data models, then everybody knows what's going to happen. We'll have very fragmented solutions. They won't work together. We won't be able to exchange data between pharma sponsors and CROs, sponsors and health authorities, between different systems. And that's not what we need at this point as an industry to really modernize and transform and digitize. We're far behind when you think about it in terms of the 150-page PDF document is the basis for starting every study. we're so far behind in the industry, and there's reasons for that, but this is an opportunity to really change that by working together. You know, we do see from a roadmap perspective, obviously we've started focusing on the automation and the flow from digital protocol authoring tools towards EDC systems, but there's clearly many other downstream consumers of protocol data, and we want to get to that write once, read many proposition that Allison mentioned on one of the earlier slides. I mean, there's SDTM submission files, clinical trial management systems, IBRS systems, even trial supply systems, many systems that use and require some information from a clinical protocol. And those would all be on the roadmap to start expanding, to start developing a richer set of connections. And then much, you know, beyond that, you can start thinking of e-source models. So going into integration with EHR systems and other connections with real world data stores. So there's many opportunities. Those are going to be more complex and involve HL7 standards and other stakeholders that we haven't engaged with yet, but you can see the possibilities if we build out the foundation as we're intending to. And then finally, Allison had it on one of the earlier slides, we're focused right now mostly on study startup processes, protocol authoring, study startup, but we see this kind of model extending to the whole clinical development life cycle, you know, so through to site initiation and patient recruitment processes, study execution, data acquisition, analysis and reporting, and all the way to regulatory submission. So, you know, that's a lot to take on, and we're not taking that on now, but we see that possibility to extend this kind of approach throughout the study life cycle, and that would be kind of the long-term vision that we're aiming for.
Lovely, Bill, thank you. And Julie, do you have any thoughts around what Bill shared with us there?
Yes, I mean, 100% agree with Bill there. You know, really understand why our focus to begin with is protocol to data collection, EDC systems. You know, that's sort of foundational, you know, and really building this out further downstream. But, you know, that's where you start getting that real value. But you've got to get those pieces up front first, where you're really setting that foundation. You know, and once we get through that, you know, I agree, extending it further upstream as well, right? Being able to pull EHR data directly into your data collection system, or even directly downstream straight to your SCTM data sets or analysis data sets. Being able to do those sorts of things, you know, are pretty visionary and will provide a ton of value. And you look at things even just like an SCTM, what industry for the most part does now, you know, typing your trial design data, you know, for your trial to design domains and spreadsheets, and then pulling that through because it's not really in your EDC system. So where's your source for that? So being able to do those sorts of things pretty early on, even with these foundational components, will be important. And then pulling that all together, your clinical data from all your sources into your downstream data sets is important. But looking beyond that, even further out than just, you know, and back to kind of the things Galen was saying about analytics and, you know, others on innovation, you know, we are working on a number of AI machine learning type projects across our ecosystem. And it would really be great to look at where after these, you know, pieces that, you know, focusing on the areas we're used to around the clinical development lifecycle, kind of extending beyond that and into the innovation, what can be really transformational. Again, looking at the use cases there around AI machine learning, can we use it to automate common models for training machine learning algorithms, stuff like that? Are there things we can do from standardized analytics? A really good example is, can we have certain models that would be consistent across the industry for things like patient profiles? And then it, you know, provides so much more value on just, you know, safety monitoring, medical monitoring, areas like that as well, having some pretty common things that they would be used to seeing no matter what therapeutic area, things like that. So that's really, you know, kind of the things I'd like to see even longer term. And we know that we've got to get these foundational things right first. But ultimately, of course, the value proposition for any of this is really, like others have said, driving automation can help become more efficient. It can drive quality as well. And, you know, our goal ultimately in the industry is to really be able to deliver life-changing, life-saving treatments to patients faster and more efficiently. So Matt, turning over to you, just similar insight, what kind of insights do you have from your organization there? What have you guys been envisioning, and what, especially that longer term vision, value drivers for the digital data flow?
Yeah, I mean, from the RedCap Cloud perspective, we look at all different types of integrations and different types of data flows into our system. So whether that be from the SDR or whether it be from other systems, I think it's truly important to look at pieces of data that are used across multiple systems to ensure consistency, and that's where the value is within this platform. So if there's a piece of data or an integration that we need to do that's specific to that study, and that's one piece of data that we need, and it's only used by one downstream system, maybe there's not value in potentially looking at the SDR as part of a component of that. But the obvious place to start was the protocol, where that is used across various systems and downstream, including the EDC. But as we look in the future, the sky's the limit. It's truly those systems and those pieces of data that can be used in downstream systems that are going to enable less data errors throughout the process and speed to market in the end to enable the patient. So that's a big vision, but I think what we're all striving for.
And just I'll put that same kind of question for just some final remarks from you, actually, if that's okay.
Sure. So, I think that there is the potential to minimize study build times and maximize quality in requirement creation by creating or standardizing these templates and study designs. We have the ability potentially to standardize across different levels, like the sponsor or CRO level. You're going to be using potentially tried and true design elements that have been previously tested or used. Again, kind of ensuring that quality loop has been exercised. I see the biggest benefit of DDF long term for sponsors is to significantly simplify their processes and remove these silos that exist between the program and protocol design through to execution. So it could potentially remove significant manual work that is spent mapping or transforming data as it flows along this continuum of systems. Of course, along with that, as kind of we've outlined previously, there's the challenge of getting sponsors or others on board with adhering or adopting these sorts of standards so that they match what we would expect to see in this SDR. And also probably this SDR data should be regularly reviewed or updated over time to ensure that the latest, greatest, or the best design is being used, or the templates may become, start to deviate from what is actually needed by the industry.
No, that's some really great insights from all of you there. And we've come up to time. So I'd just like to really send my appreciation to all of the panelists today. Really some great insights from across both pharma and from our vendors that we're collaborating with on DDF. I hope you all feel that you're going away from this webinar with a bit more information around the kind of value proposition in the short and the long term of digital data flow, and a better understanding of exactly what it's going to offer going forward, and the opportunities that you have to engage with DDF and to be part of the Connectathon and forthcoming events and future development of DDF as we move into the future. So thank you all very, very much for joining us today. If you have any further questions, apologies that we haven't got to questions that have been submitted during the webinar today. We will log all of those and we will provide responses to those questions offline. But if you have other questions, please email us at ddf@transceleratebiopharmainc.com. You can learn more at the DDF website, and the recording of this webinar will be available soon on the Transcelerate website events page. With that, thank you all very much to all of the panelists today. I really appreciate your time, and thank you to everybody that's dialed in and joined us for the webinar today. Thank you.
Thank you.